In this episode, the houses we want and the choices we make. Welcome to Two Architects and a Lawyer. Join architect Luis de Miguel in Valencia and architect lawyer William McLean in Vancouver for observations and commentary on all things design. Here are William and Luis.
Well, hello, Louis. You wanted to talk about housing. Let's get going on that subject. Where do people want to live and why?
Ideally, where people want to live, they want to live in the sort of American suburban idea, except that they don't want a little lot with a little house in the middle. They want a huge lot with a huge house in the middle, i.e., they want something like Versailles, pretty much. So anything other than Versailles is obviously a compromise and somewhat disappointing. So clearly, there's not enough land in the world for everybody to live that way.
I know what you're saying, and we've exchanged some photographs of housing typologies, I guess you could call them, point blocks and linear slabs and single family houses and so on. And when I look at that array of photographs, they're all images of the exteriors of housing. The experience that people have of their housing is not so much on the exterior at all. It's very much on the interior. So there's this double experience that people have of housing. They know what housing looks like from the kind of bird's eye view of the neighborhood, but their real interest in housing is what they experience on the inside.
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's something called curb appeal, and curb appeal is, basically it means nice landscaping, to be perfectly blunt. And I think we've had this discussion before about how you can take any little box, and if you spruce it up with the landscaping, no pun intended, you can really fix up any horrible little boxy thing and make it look nice, at least appealing, as it were. So yes, curb appeal is important up to a certain extent, but you're right.
Well, you've skipped from the single family home dream to the reality, which is that people who can't afford those single family homes are going to find some alternative. The alternative tends to be what developers provide for them. And you've described a successful experience with a project. The experience is quite variable, obviously, from building to building and architect to architect. But the very fact that architects are involved with one of those types of housing, but not so much the other. The single family houses developments tend to be developer built without architectural involvement or very little architectural involvement. Architects do have a chance to intervene with other types of housing. As you pointed out to me last week, it's quite different from the architect's involvement with public buildings, government buildings, cultural buildings, where often there is some competition, whether it's the informal type that leads to the architect being chosen by the client, or whether it's a formal sanctioned competition. But housing is rarely subject to those competitive urges, which tend to produce good results in other types of buildings. Why do you think that is? And do you think we'd be better off if there were competitions
Well,
that were labeled housing?
yeah, well, there is another kind of development that developers produce with an architect, and those are townhouses.
Well, as a practicing lawyer, a construction lawyer, we would get involved in projects not as small as a single family house typically, but for low-rise multiple housing. I was always amazed at the quality of the drawings, which tended to be pretty good. I mean, the drawings themselves were good, but the design was uniformly lousy. And I'm sure if you ask those young, and they tended to be young, ambitious architects who were getting these projects from developers and feeling lucky that they did, if you asked them why they weren't doing a better job, they would shrug their shoulders, tell you that the budget was so tight. They had to make do with a per square foot budget, which was far lower than it should have been. You don't hear that pushback from lawyers, doctors, engineers. Architects seem to be incredibly willing to use budget as a cudgel that they beat themselves with.
Huh.
And that's something that irritates me greatly. We don't have the backbone as architects to stand up to that pressure from clients.
Well, I have to disagree. I think they were lying. I think the budget of a bungalow was pretty much well known to everybody. I mean, at the time, it was roughly $100 a square foot. So, and that didn't change for many, many years. And everybody agreed that that's what. And if you wanted to, when Avi Friedman came up with the affordable housing, he had this brilliant idea. He didn't change the budget. He just made the house real small. So instead of the house costing 100,000, cost 50,000. And that was the affordable house. He didn't invent anything. He just made it half as big as a normal house. Everybody seemed to say, "Wow, what a genius!" I mean, like there was no mystery there. And I'll tell you something: the house that he did that was affordable was actually quite nice. It was a nice little bungalow thing, but very nicely designed.
Where I am in British Columbia, of course, architects are not required to be participants in the process that leads to a single family house being built. I'm sure that's the same in Quebec.
Yes.
When you were practicing there. So there is a threshold beyond which an architect is required. Below that threshold, an architect can be required if the client's persuaded that it's a good idea. But just back to that budget point I was making a minute ago, you'd agree with me, I'm sure, that we're conditioned, maybe not overtly, but somehow we pick up in the culture at architecture school and first practice after architecture school that we need to be terrifically concerned about budget. We need to be designing to the lowest possible ultimate cost to the client. And that's the point I was trying to make. That's not the mindset of a medical practitioner, a legal practitioner, even an engineer, a structural engineer who would never say, no, I'm cutting corners here because the client expects me not to exceed a certain amount of money. It's that mental attitude, I think, which surely is responsible for some of the awfulness that we talked about a minute ago. That
No, I don't
seems
think
to be.
so. No, I'm sorry. Again, I bring it back to there was a standard number for a built environment in a house. A wood frame house costs, like I said, roughly $100 a square foot, and everybody knew. And you could make a nice little house like the Avi Friedman affordable house. That was affordable because it was very small, so it was only affordable there. But there weren't, the idea. Nobody built a bungalow with marble on the wall and even marbles on the floor, or it was all pretty standard. And it was just a design was it had to look like a house. If you ask a child to draw a house, he'll draw a thing with a pitched roof, and that's a house. And that's pretty much. And I remember Dan Hangen, who started doing some townhouse projects in Nuns Island. The first thing he did was he cut off that pitch and made all the roofs flat, which frankly in Canada, I mean, it really doesn't make a lot of sense. But the technology was there to deal with never mind the lawsuits that came after. I won't get into that. but 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 I think there was a tremendous departure between an architect design house had to have a flat roof and a developer house had to have a pitched roof. And that was it. And they pretty much cost the same. Of course, the land, depending on where they were, had a big impact on the price of the house. But a 2x4 cost the same thing in downtown Montreal or way out in the sticks somewhere. And the carpenter charged exactly the same thing downtown Montreal. And I mean, you get the picture. So there was no big deal about because there was nothing exotic. I remember when houses, all of a sudden, we started using steel studs and so on. That made a big difference because it was more expensive. However, it was a lot quicker. And of course, when we got rid of lath and plaster, wet plaster and we went to drywall. Well, again, the drywall was more expensive, but it was much faster. And so the whole point was to make it as quickly as possible. And the budget was still $100. It didn't matter.
Well, I'll tell you a story about an interior designer that I know who worked in a fairly large multidiscipline firm in Calgary. And they had a condominium project in Calgary, which had a number of floors, and there were market price condominiums all the way up to the penthouse. The developer was going to move into the penthouse. And his instruction to the interior design department was, if your budget was X per square foot for those lower floors, the budget in my unit, the penthouse, is going to be X plus 50%. And this completely flummoxed the interior designers. They were going crazy trying to figure out how to spend this extra money.
That's right.
They couldn't do it. They weren't educated to do it. Their education fought every instinct that they had. I mean, they were thinking of things like, well, maybe we can gold plate the faucets.
Yes.
Add marble where marble doesn't make any sense just to get that price up. They couldn't get near it, the actual target. It was something they dreamed about until that minute and then couldn't deal with it.
Well, the way we used to do this, like spend a lot of money, was in lighting. Because lighting, that you started playing with recessed lighting and sort of hidden, indirect, dropping the ceiling a little bit, making a cove, that kind of stuff. That added money. That became much more expensive than a flat ceiling and just normal fixtures and that sort of thing.
But, again, I'll just contrast what we've been talking about with those other professions that I keep mentioning. Medicine, structural engineering, the legal world. You couldn't imagine asking any of those professionals to spend more on working up your case that's going to the Supreme Court. Or, yes, I see your structural design for this new bridge, but I want you to spend more money. No, the answer from the structural engineer would be, I'll spend exactly what's required to solve this problem, and I'll try to do it as elegantly as I can within that constraint. The lawyer would say the same thing, and so would the doctor in his own way.
Just a second. No, there's a big change with the lawyer. You want the lawyer, you want the most expensive lawyer. I mean, if you're going to go to jail, or never mind if your life is at stake, but let's just say you're going to go to jail for quite a while. You don't want some guy fresh out of school. And if you need a heart transplant, you're not going to go to some little clinic that just opened up in a shopping center. You're going to go to the Mayo Clinic. You're going to go to Stanford. You're going to go, the very famous places. Why? Because your life is at stake, but you can live. A human being can live anywhere. It doesn't matter. You can put a person in any place at all, and they'll muddle through and hopefully work their ass off, make enough money to get out of the place.
I think that's a very key thing. I think it's a normal human instinct to feel at home, to use that phrase, no matter where they are, and to make it their home.
What I'm getting at is that there hasn't been a single house that had to be demolished because it was so unlivable. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
However, two major examples. One is the Villa Savoye by none other than Le Corbusier, okay? And the other one is the Farnsworth house by the other none other, as you know, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. And those two, in fact, not only was there a judicial case against both architects, the Villa Savoye came this close to getting demolished simply because the owners couldn't spend more than one night in the house. They spent one night in the house and they fled. I mean, in horror. I mean, this place was too hot in the summer, too cold in the winter. I mean, it was literally, they said, this place is unlivable. However, turns out these are adored by architects, students, you name it. They're the epitome of housing. And nobody bothers to look a little further. And frankly, while I'm on the subject, There is a picture of falling water by none other. And this thing in the winter, it is absolutely ghastly, because all the water is actually freezes over, and it's just it's just horrendous. They spent, I think it was at least 15 years ago, they spent $8 million to renovate this house.
Well,
Eight million.
none of the houses you mentioned. I mean, I think this is a strange diversion from our bigger topic here, because nobody seriously considers any of those three houses as a model for housing in our any kind of economic climate. And it's not just an economic issue; it's a functional issue, as you're pointing out. These weren't houses which were meant to be models for others to follow. You
Of
can't
course
imagine
they
a
were.
subdivision of Paul Waters or Farnsworth's or Villa Savoy's. They're sculptural, artistic.
No, they were models. I mean, Corbu called it a house, a machine for living. For him, this thing was going to be, there were going to be millions of these houses built all over the world, because the house was a machine for living. And the Farnsworth house has been copied left, right, and center with different. I mean, Philip Johnson did the same thing. I mean, all kinds of people did this, except the people that wanted to live there, because nobody wants to live in a glass box. It's unlivable. I mean, first of all, you need 40 billion acres so that nobody can see you, just walking around. The whole idea is crazy. And I'll go one step further. You and I remember there was a guy named Moshe Safdie who did a thesis, which then was built. And the thing in 1967 cost $100 million, or this is what they admitted, because it was probably more, but it was just unbelievable. I mean, let's say the same building, normal construction would cost maybe 10 million. This was 10 times more. Beautiful building, completely wrong for Montreal climate. Completely.
It's more than a building, though. I mean, surely the point of that project, which was after all being exhibited at a World's Fair, was to show the world that there was a way to approach housing which was different from the standard method of delivering housing. His vision at McGill, as somebody approaching graduation with his thesis project, was to show that through modularity you could come up with possibly an interesting result, which was, in his mind, if volume allowed, would become less expensive, not more expensive.
Yeah.
It was certainly never the object to make it 10 times more expensive than the average. It was the opposite. It was to make it a tenth.
No, I know. I know that that was the object and all that, but I think what was wrong here was to say, no, let's go ahead and build it, and show the people, show the world how this is done. There's a huge developer, one of the biggest developers in America, uh, and this guy put out, I don't know, 100,000, 1,000,000 houses. He provided housing for people, affordable housing, and they the costs down, and people could afford them. People coming back from the war and so on. He basically invented suburbia. He bought the land. It was cheap. It was far from the center, and he made these curving streets and all that. And of course, nobody studies that, and everybody poo-poos the whole thing. But this guy provided housing for people that had gone to war and came back and didn't have a lot of money, and they could afford a house of their own. Yes, Levittown. Thank you.
Was there an architect involved with that?
I have no idea. I have
Yeah.
nobody has looked at this thing beyond saying this is horrendous. Everybody looks at Habitat and says, "Oh, this is wonderful." But one Habitat, okay, you could have built the whole goddamn Levittown, no problem.
Mhm.
And to me,
Yeah.
if you're trying to house people, yes, of course it'd be great if we could all live in Versailles, but we can't live in Versailles. We don't have hundreds of acres and a house the size of a football stadium. So We have to make do with what we have.
Let's go back a little bit to Moshe Safdie and Habitat. As I remember, the slogan that surrounded that project when it was produced at Expo 67 that captivated people was there was going to be a garden for every person or every house or something like that. Even though these were relatively high density structures, they allowed for some kind of private outdoor space, which was innovative at the time. You mentioned Corbusier and the idea that machines for living, there were going to be, certainly as high-rise buildings were intended to be multiplied in great number and provide housing solution for a great number of people. Do architects have a responsibility to think about these things, and is there any hope in architects getting this right at some time in the future? The effort continues. Every city has examples of good individual condominium buildings and not so good ones, unmemorable ones. But that's just one building type. There's very little that is multiplied within a single city, let alone across countries and other cities.
Yes.
Is that a reasonable quest for architects to pursue to solve this problem?
Well, I think, yeah, it'd be good, if we could solve it. But I've dealt with a lot of developers, and they're not interested in solving any problem. They're interested in making money, And so, but in order to make money, they have to provide a product that sells. And I think the problem is that an architect is seen as going to cost you an arm and a leg, because the architect wants to make some kind of sculpture, some statement, because maybe nobody else is going to call him again. Who was the other guy that was very involved in housing at McGill was Norbert Schoner. I don't think he designed too many buildings. He wrote about them.
What I remember about Norbert Schonauer was his very persuasive demonstration of taking cubic volumes of potential housing and rearranging them on the same site to change what might be a 6-story block in the middle of the site to a perimeter low-rise 2 or 3-story arrangement with a courtyard in the middle. And of course, it was self-evidently obvious which one of those two the average person would choose. And that was a good lesson, it seemed to me, in design, that with very small interventions such as that, you can greatly affect the outcome. But again, that's a luxury that's available to architects who are working with multiple housing. You have much more of a likelihood that you're going to produce an interesting result if you're working with repetitive forms, large sites, approaches from different angles, and so on. But the single family thing is a different matter, and perhaps we've been blurring the lines here. We shouldn't be talking so much about single family houses and more about the more typical housing that people are confronted with in the cities where they live. Just to take that Norbert Schonauer example, there's high density low rise as opposed to low density high rise. That's a basic option that developers have to choose from. You can choose to make the building itself sculptural or slab-like, transparent or not. These are basic decisions that you see over and over again in very small variations in any downtown in America and perhaps parts of Europe. There seems to be constant tinkering with those variables. Not that any perfect answer is ever going to result from it, but as you point out, the tension all the time is what's going to sell. And in fact, is my building going to sell faster and at a higher price than the building across the street? That's the great drive that architects are or the hot breath that they're feeling on their neck. As you say, they want the next commission, and to do so, they have to show that the result that they produce is a saleable product.
Don't forget that municipalities play a much larger role because you've got things like zoning.
Part of our discussion today has been about individual desire for particular housing types and the developer's response to that by producing what they think is going to sell and become attractive. I wonder if it's worth asking people who are listening to this how they view different types of housings and voting on what they would prefer to see more of in their own neighborhood.
Well,
can we come up with a poll that might...
It's an excellent idea. Excellent idea. We'll just put up a poll and let's see how many people pick the bungalow and how many people pick the skyscraper.